Hey guys, Matt Allen here. Welcome back to Tactical Bassin. Today we're talking about the top 5 baits for bass fishing in July. These are baits that you can rely on to catch fish when it gets hot. We're still a few days short of July, but it's coming quickly and I want you guys to be prepared before it gets here. July is the hottest month of the year. When that air temp starts to rise, the water temp follows. And when it gets too hot in a lot of the country, the bass get extremely lethargic. Now, that's not actually bad news. The fact that they get lethargic makes them predictable. It means that they go to predictable places, they feed at predictable times because they're struggling in that hot water. It does not mean that the bite gets tough. July can be incredible. The hotter it gets, oftentimes the better. And when the fish bunch up, they're really bunched up. We'll get to more of that. Now, I said we're doing top 5 baits, and we are. We're going to do the top 5 baits for that traditional bass fishing, that heavy cover, power fishing type bass fishing that goes on in most of the country. But as soon as we're done talking about them, I'm gonna tack on 5 more baits. So a total of 10. The second half, these are baits that are going to apply in more of that finesse scenario. So power fishing type fisheries, finesse type fisheries, northern guys, spotted bass, smallmouth, reservoir guys. It would be wise to listen to all 10 baits, even though only half specifically apply to your style of fishing, because there is some major crossover. We'll get to that, but it's 5 traditional baits plus 5 more finesse style baits so that everybody is included. But to kick this off, July. As that water gets hot, my first place that I love to go is topwater. Now, I chose a frog. The reason why I chose a frog is that it is very forgiving. What I mean by that is that as it gets super hot, the hotter it gets, the bass that are in that true summer pattern have split. We know that after the spawn, bass go out, they recover, and then they split. Some go shallow, some go deep. The ones that go shallow, the hotter it gets, they bury up in that cover. The ones that go deep move to outside structure, to rock, to hard bottom. That's where they're located. So those shallow fish, well, we already know, are up in the cover. Now that can be that traditional pad field. It can be the cheese mats. But maybe your fishery doesn't have that. A frog is still a major player, even if you don't have those things, because the bass will move up on laydowns. They'll move up in shade pockets under the trees. They'll be in and around docks, sitting back in those dark holes. And a frog is an extremely forgiving bait because I can throw it back up under a dock way in there where I'm not sure where it's gonna land. And most of the time, because the hooks are protected, I can get it right back out of there. I can throw it in the middle of a laydown and pull it up through those branches without getting stuck all the time. So my number 1 topwater, even if I don't have cheese or lily pads, is the frog. Walking that frog in open water or fishing it over the top of cover. The hotter it gets, the tighter those fish will get to cover, the more predictable they will become. My number 2 bait is a swim jig. Why a swim jig? July, again, hottest month of the year. Water temps are peaking out. Fish are lethargic. As a result, they are less likely to be charging all over the grass flats, running up and down the bank feeding. They are much more likely to suck tight to that cover. I know that in the middle of the day, the bass, height of the day, peak of the sun, the bass will be the tightest to cover. I take the frog to that near shore cover, right up tight. But if I have grass clumps that are out in the open, if I have standing timber, if I have anything in open water that those fish will bunch up against, I turn to the swim jig. Before July, you'll see me throwing a swim jig, a chatterbait, a beast hook swim bait, a flashy swimmer. But the hotter it gets, the tighter they get to that cover, and I trust that swim jig to get in and out without getting snagged because of that weed guard. Now, if I could only throw one, I throw a heavy California swim jig. This is a 3/4 ounce. It's got a great big swim bait on the back of it. And I'm gonna link the exact baits, everything down in the video description. The exact baits, favorite colors, weights, all that stuff to make it really, really simple for you. But the reason I throw that heavy head is that I can use it to bust grass. So almost every other bait that you will throw, if you're fishing around grass, you have to fish in the open lanes, the little gaps between the grass. The swim jig, I run it right into the heart of the grass and just bust it through. It's something that those fish don't see. And because they're sitting right there in the grass, when this thing comes plowing through, they just smash on it. It's one of my favorite ways to catch them in July. Next up is a Texas rig. Texas rigged creature bait specifically. Now, what I love about a Texas rig is that this is actually a giant topic. And every one of these are things that we'll be throwing in the coming weeks, and we'll be talking about much more in depth. But today I want to give you that jump ahead, that shot to prepare, to have the things that you need to be sitting in the garage at night rigging the right stuff so that when you are actually in July, in the heart of the bite, you're not scrambling to catch up. So the beauty of a Texas rig is that I can pair it up with a great big heavyweight, and I can punch heavy cover. I can get deep in that stuff, same place I'm throwing that frog, way back in there, pull those fish out. But I can take that exact same bait, same hook and everything, pair it up with a little tiny weight, drop down to say a 3/16 tungsten, and now all of a sudden I can fish it almost like a jig, but I can fish that on dock pilings, on laydowns, around sparse grass. I can throw it in a lot more places. So that Texas rig is incredibly adaptable from the thinnest cover to the thickest cover, very, very simply. Now, let's talk about the other half of these fish. Those baits were geared towards those fish that went shallow after the post spawn. What about those fish that sucked back out? Those fish that move out, they go to outside points, they get out on the main lake. On the river systems, those are those ledge fish you hear about. These are fish that are moving to outside humps, getting on that hard structure, rock piles, rock outcrops, rocky points, bluffs, those sorts of areas. Two more baits for you. Number one is the jig. And this is the time of year that you just cannot beat, I think, a pitching jig. Now, you could throw a football jig too, a heavy football jig, but I love a pitching jig because it can do everything. And again, we're talking about 5 baits. We are narrowing down bass fishing to 5 little baits. The beauty of a pitching style jig with an archy style head is that I can take that and I can fish out in 15, 20, 30, 40 feet of water. And I can fish that in rock. But that head shape will also allow me to turn around and get up here and fish around wood or around grass and in cover as well. The only place it truly doesn't shine is that thick grass. Then you want a flipping jig. But for thinner grass, all the way out to hard rock and offshore structure, that pitching jig will get it done. And if I could only have one, it would be a 1/2 ounce because I can do everything with it. Paired up with a favorite creature, I throw the beaver a lot this time of year because as everything is getting hot, it's almost like wintertime. Everything is more lethargic. Everything moves a little slower. That's why you're not hearing me list off chatterbaits, spinnerbaits, fast-moving topwaters. Everything is slowing down because in the hottest part of the year, these fish start to struggle, much like they do at the very coldest part of the winter. It's not easy for them to get by in that heat. So everything's slower. So I like that little bit more subtle on my bigger profile jig. Because if I put a big aggressive trailer on here, the whole package just becomes too much. Last, but definitely not least, I think if I had to go out in the summertime and I could only have one bait, period, and you didn't tell me if I was going to a power fishing fishery or whether I was going to somewhere where I had to finesse or if I was going to a river, if you didn't tell me any of that, you just said you've got one shot, I think a shaky head is where I would go. A shaky head with a straight tail worm. This is a T-Mac. That is by far my favorite shaky head worm. The shaky head allows me again to do a little bit of everything. I can fish shallow if I need to, fish cover if I need to, but I can back out to that outside structure, that rock. And this can be rock in 3 feet of water or rock in 30 feet of water. But when those fish bunch up on that outer structure, that shaky head gets down there. I can fish it on lighter line. I can use light tackle all the way around, and I will get more bites. And the amazing thing about a shaky head, black blue and June bug. Those are my favorites. June bug in the summertime is incredible, but that black blue, or in this case, black blue with some green pumpkin mixed in, those colors just get big bites. So even though I'm throwing a little worm, I'm not eliminating my shot at a giant bass. What I'm doing is maximizing my time. I'm catching more fish because I'm worming and I'm not throwing something great big, but I'm not eliminating my shot at the big bite. I'm looking for both. And that makes that a very, very powerful technique this time of year. So that wraps up those 5 baits. It's that simple. Going shallow, frog, swim jig, punching, flipping, that Texas rig, and then as I back out, jig and a shaky head. That's it. You don't need to be doing a ton of fast moving fishing this time of year. Now, some fisheries, of course, there are exceptions. There's still plenty of room for deep cranking, shallow cranking, and all that. But if you're in those truly hot fisheries, when it gets really hot, you're better off slowing it down. Now, let's take those. I'm going to slide those out of the way. Let's talk about more of a finesse scenario. Highland reservoirs, clear water creeks, clear water rivers. Those fish that are just a little more sensitive, that don't want to run out and eat a frog. Same concepts are going to apply, but it's different baits. First off, a popper. Still a topwater, but a popper. I can take a popper, I can get it near cover. Now I can't put it in a laydown like I can a frog, but I can get it up there close. The beauty of a popper is that I can fish it slow. I'm not fishing this thing hard. I'm not slamming that popper. I'm just barely touching it. Just let it sit. One little pop, let it sit. Let those rings settle out. Pop it again, let it sit. I'm moving slowly enough that the fish that are in that cover are willing to come out and get that bait. So you can catch a lot of fish, especially during the low light periods of the day with that popper. Second up is a Senko. How could you do this video and not include a Senko? We're talking about middle of summer, we're talking lethargic. A Senko will flat catch fish, specifically a wacky rigged 5-inch Senko. If I could only have one, that's the one. Why a wacky rig? Without being on your lake, I don't know if your specific lake has grass or not. I don't know if your specific lake has standing timber or not. But what I do know is that if I want to get the maximum number of bites, I'm going to do it with light line. And by going to a wacky rig, I can drop down, use a size 1 hook. I can drop down to 7 or 8 pound line, and I'm going to get way more bites than I would get if I was throwing a Texas rig on 12 or 15 pound line. So that little wacky rig will do great things for you. Next up, that bait that's still going to cover a little bit of water, that's still going to draw that reaction strike. There are bait fish shallow this time of year. It's going to be a little swim bait, specifically with an underspin blade on it. This is the cool baits, But this is not as small as the cool baits that we turn to when we're finessing. A lot of times we talk about an 1/8 ounce cool bait with a 2.8 Kitech. This is a 1/4 ounce with a 3.8, so it's a little bigger. But the benefit of this one in particular is that it's still a small hook. It's a 3/0 hook, but it's light wire. So I can throw it on, again, really light line, 8 or 10 pound line. I can fish it ultra slow and just crawl it along the bottom if those fish are in deep water. Or if I'm out there in the morning and it's still cool first thing and those fish are up feeding a little bit, I can chuck it and wind it like I would a spinnerbait or a crankbait or a chatterbait. So I can take one bait and I can cover both scenarios. I can get that morning reaction bite, and then I can drop out and I can slow fish for those lethargic fish with that one bait. Now, talking about, again, going outside, I've got 2 more for you, and one of them is going to surprise you. This guy right here is the next one up. Little Kitech tungsten football jig. The jig just plain gets big bites. That's why you see the jig over here in the other pile. But that little tiny guy just does something special in that clear water. It will continue to get bit when bites are shutting down. When fish do not want to cooperate, you can turn to that little guy with that little tiny hook on light line. That's that theme, light line, clear water. I can drop down, again, 8, 10 pound line, and I'm good to go. Now, this time of year, when I'm throwing that little Kitech jig or any other tiny little finesse jig, because finesse jigs are their own rabbit hole. I mean, I could open up boxes of finesse jigs for you, but I chose one and I went with some great color patterns, heavier heads. This is a 1/2 ounce, even though it's small. And then that tiny hook that I can rely on to hook those fish in that deeper water. But I'm pairing this up with a trailer that does have some movement. So that larger profile, I stay pretty basic, pretty small. I don't want a lot of movement out of my trailer. I want a trailer that's compact, and I want a trailer that doesn't do a whole lot. But in that smaller jig, I want to make up for some of that size with a little bit of movement. So this is the pack-a-chunk, but it's the tiny one. It's the little junior. And that guy will flap in the water, but I like the overall profile. I can fish it slow, and there's no movement. It's a dead action trailer. I could drag that on the bottom. But let's say I'm fishing a river for smallmouth. I can get more aggressive with that thing, and that thing will be kicking in the current, and those fish will come charging for it. So that's a way that I can take that little bait and I can get it to work in more scenarios by using a more aggressive trailer, but I have the ability to slow it down and have it become a dead action or a no movement trailer as well. Now, last up, I sat and I thought about Ned rigs, drop shots, some of those different things. And I went with a tube. And let me tell you why I went with a tube. I went with a tube because I don't think somebody else would. I think someone else would choose one of those others. At this time of year, if you need a bite, if you're a tournament guy and you need a bite, if you're out there fun fishing and you need a bite, this is something I rely on. This is something I did at Clear Lake. Clear Lake is a power fishery. We catch them on giant swim baits, we catch them cranking, we catch them all sorts of different ways. But very few people have any idea how many fish I caught on Clear Lake on a tube in the middle of summer. When the going is good, I'm out there frogging, flipping, punching, swim baiting, deep cranking, all power fishing. But I would guide day after day after day after day. And sometimes you got those days where those fish just didn't cooperate. And where other people would turn to a worm or a jig, I went all the way to the other end of the spectrum. And I'd have one of my guys throwing a tube. It's something different. And that tube is special. A tube on its own is a fantastic bait. I would put it up against any of those other finesse presentations. But in a fishery where people are throwing shaky heads, where they're throwing creature baits, where they're throwing a Ned rig, you can come out throwing something completely different and it will pay off. Every time I would turn to the tube in summer when I needed a bite, it came through. Every time. Now, if you're in a clear water fishery, I recommend fishing it on an exposed hook, just like that. If you're in a fishery that's got a lot of grass, you can take a tube and treat it just like a Texas rig. You can Texas rig that tube, peg a weight on it, and fish it in and around that cover. But I love fishing it on that exposed head on a really light line to get me those key bites when it seems like nothing else will work. And you can apply that to a finesse lake, and you can apply that to some of the most famous power fishing fisheries around this country. All right, guys, 5 baits for each scenario. Hopefully that helps you. Again, we're doing this a few days before July so that you can get prepared. You know what the pattern is, you know what's coming, and you can have the right things tied on the next time you go out there. We'll link everything down in the video description for you. I'll break down the baits with favorite colors, sizes, all of that to make it really simple for you. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, subscribe to our channel. We appreciate you, and we'll talk to you soon.